Hey, John, welcome to Into the Mind of Music. It's good to have you on the show.
It's good to
John,
be here.
yeah, John is a great friend of mine, man. We go way back a long time, and we're here to talk about a little um, music law and stuff like that. But first, John, why don't you tell people what? Well, let's start at the beginning. What made you decide to become a drummer? Because John is a fantastic drummer. We've done a bunch of different shows and stuff together. So why don't we talk about that a little bit first?
It's a funny story. When I was a little kid and I used to go to parades with my parents, I have a vague memory of covering my ears when the band would come by because of the sound of the drums. But as I got a little older, I took drum lessons in grammar school, and I just kept with it. And music has always been something that has been a passion, and it just developed over the course of time. In high school, I excelled in band and marching band and different things, and my love for music grew. Decided I wanted to major that in college, and we're really fueled to a maximum as I went when I went to college. I had the great blessing to be studying with somebody named Michael Carvin, and for those of you who have not heard of him, I strongly recommend you look him up. Carvin, Michael Carvin, great drummer, great jazz drummer, was Motown studio drummer for years and a fantastic teacher. I went through Rutgers. I had great people there. Uh, uh, Shout out to Ralph Peterson Jr., who unfortunately just passed away, but a great drummer I went to school with. Larry Crockett's another good friend of mine and also a good friend of John. Actually, how I met John through Larry. And it just continued from there. I mean, music was always a passion, and it still is. If I had my druthers, I would be doing that more than practicing law, but the reality of the world dictates otherwise.
Yeah, that's for sure. It does.
Mhm.
Yeah, music is a tough road. The Rutgers department back then was, I mean, or it was Rutgers and Livingston, right?
Well,
And because I remember Kenny Barron
mhm.
and who was the bass player, the
Well,
well-known bass player at
the,
the time?
the bass player was Larry Ridley.
Larry Ridley. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Who also taught a course called Evolution of Jazz, which I had taken. It was one of the core courses for the jazz studies program, other than performance. And also, there was a trumpet teacher there named William Fielder, who was very well renowned. One of his famous students was Terence Blanchard. But we had a lot, and Terence Blanchard also was in school when I first got there. But as far as your question about that, Livingston was where the program had its base when I first went in, but that was right around the time that Rutgers went through reorganization and Mason Gross School of Arts came into being. And when that transition was being made, most everything moved over to Douglas campus, where there's an old music building. Those of you who drive along Route 18, if you're driving up on the hill, you see a big brick building. That's the old music building. And there were practice rooms and piano rooms in there and some classes. And then the new facility, which is where the Rutgers Auditorium is, which is where a lot of the other music classes took place. So at that time, they upgraded the facility. They had some great professors. We had Paul Jeffries, who was the jazz band director for the first 2 years, I believe I was there. And then we had different jazz band directors the third and fourth year. We had somebody named Horace Young, and then we had John Stubblefield, who unfortunately has also passed away uh, over the years. But we have some very good people who've come out of Rutgers. Like I said, Ralph Peterson Jr., Terence Blanchard, Regina Bell was a singer who came out, who's had some hit records actually, and others whose names are escaping me now. But
Yeah, Kenny
I mean,
Barron.
Kenny Barron was a professor there. He's retired, but he's still active teaching. Um, Other people, as well, whose names I may not be remembering now, but also people who had gone there who were still around. That organ player named Radham Schwartz, who's still a good friend of mine today, who's made a good career for himself. A piano player named John Bianculli, who's for whatever reasons, remained local as opposed to being a New York guy, so to speak. But some just excellent, excellent people who've gone through there have made names for themselves, and it's proud to say that I was able to study there at that time.
Yeah, there was a lot of definitely there was a lot of greats there, that's for sure.
Hmm.
So what made you decide to become a lawyer and get into the whole lawyer thing?
Well, over the years, as I became a band leader in many cases, so I dealt with the business. I actually wrote the contracts for the engagements that I would book for the band. I've always been had a for lack of blowing my or for risk of sounding like I'm blowing my own horn, a good skill at negotiating uh, contracts, deals, and settlements. And the reality of the music business, unfortunately, at the local level, is economics or lack thereof. And one of the things that I noticed today, I talk to people, like when you and I talk, John, and some other people, and it seems as though the gigs that people are working today are not paying much differently than they were back in the 80s, in the 90s, which is unfortunate. And there's fewer of them, fewer clubs that have live music, and it's just changed. And then, of course, with the advent of the internet and things, the recording business has changed dramatically as well. Sometimes, in some ways, for the better, and because of access people can have to things and the market that you can go out to if you're selling online, which is the market is the world, obviously. But also, the intimacy of the business has somewhat deteriorated in many respects. And you still have your small jazz clubs in New York City and things like that, but a lot of the venues, even in New York, that used to be there, aren't there anymore, or have closed down, have become something else, which is, of course, unfortunate. So, to answer your question, the change I made after, as I was working as a musician, I always had to have a second, a job. One point, I was selling insurance. I went to a friend of mine who was a lawyer, a well-known lawyer here in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and he told me, I told him I was selling insurance, and I asked him for if he had any clients he could refer me to. First, he told me he felt sorry for me that I was selling insurance. And then he told me that, I can't give you my clients' information so you can call them his exact words and ram insurance down their throats. But if you go to law school, because he knew, some skills I had for that, because I would go to him sometimes with contracts and things and discuss them. He said he would stick around for 3 or 4 years, depending on whether I went during the day or at night, meaning if I went to law school and then when I graduated, I could have the office, which I
Wow.
thought great. He was a thriving attorney in New Brunswick. He
Hmm.
had a great business. As it turned out, I graduated and I ended up renting an office space from him. So I became his tenant um, in two different places, one and then moving into another. And then after that, I bought the office space, which is an old home at 292 Livingston Avenue in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is where I've been since 2003. So it's been good. Law business is just like any other business. You've got your ups and your downs. You've got great things. You've got cases that come in where you're on the right side. You got cases where you're coming in when you're on the more difficult side. But I'll say this: I don't you try not to use the word difficult, and I like to apply this to music too. There's nothing that's difficult because if you look at it that way, you create obstacles for yourselves. I look at it as it's just different. If you're playing in 4/4, if you have to play in 7/8, it's just different. None, you can't look at one being more difficult than the other. It's just different. And just like anything, you have to learn to adjust and adapt from one thing to another. And that's really a theory for life, actually, more than just music or law.
Yeah, that's for sure. That is for sure. So, when do you think a musician should talk to a lawyer? Does it have to be like a record if you're getting a record contract, or if you're, uh, what would you say would be the main reason that musicians, a couple of main reasons why musicians would need a lawyer?
Well, I'm going to sort of separate that question into two parts. One is when you need a lawyer, and one is when you should have one. And you hear all the lawyer jokes and everything out there, but let's set aside, what the cost is just for a second. And I know that's important for most people, but when you need a lawyer, if you're involving yourself in any type of business transactions, you always want to have somebody who can give you some advice, especially when you're first starting out. You want to avoid the store-bought contracts, so to speak, or the boilerplate type of contracts, because they're inevitably written one way or the other, favorable to one side of a transaction or another. And every situation has its own circumstances and facts. So if you're going to go out and do club work, you should maybe talk to somebody, not maybe, but you should talk to somebody to give you an idea of how to handle the business aspect of it. Booking the job, securing the job, how much is it going to be? What is it paying? How many musicians, if you have to have a certain amount of musicians there. Quite honestly, before I became a lawyer, I wrote contracts where it was to provide musical entertainment. We could have went in and played the stereo, right, for musical entertainment, and that would have satisfied the contract, although that wasn't our intention. So you're writing a contract in a way as a musician, providing that you want to. My recommendation would be is write it in a way that gives you the latitude that if things change, and I'll get to what an example in a second, that you are not bound to certain circumstance. And let's say, well, you may say, well, what could change? Well, let's say you've got a four-piece band and they come out and they know this four-piece band and it's got these four guys or four people, let's say, in the band, and something happens and one of the members either leaves, is sick, has another gig, for whatever reason can't make it, and you have to have a sub come in, or you have to work as a trio. And working as a trio, you're providing just as good entertainment for the crowd or for the customers that you otherwise would. Now, if you've contracted yourself that these are the four guys who are going to be there, and one person's different, now you could technically be in breach of an agreement. And that may sound like splitting hairs, but anyone who's a working musician probably has come into or for a sufficient amount of time, probably has come into some circumstance where, for some reason, the club owner or whoever they're getting paid by might just be looking for an excuse to get out of the payment or pay less. And I could
Right.
give you several examples of that myself, both that I've experienced and that I have experienced for others, and that I had to represent clients on getting paid. So you want to have a contract, and then what should you put in the contract? Well, first you want to let's use the word, and you can take the definition, excuse me, of the following word: essential terms. So you want to say, what are the essential terms? How much are you getting paid? Where is it going to occur? You want the club name and club address in there. What what you require? What is the club owner requiring? And if he's requiring a certain type of music, you may want to put that in. But if you don't have to, don't, because then you're not going to be locked into anything. You don't know if somebody comes in and makes a request and you want to play that request, and it's not going to be in the line with what you're contracted to do. So you want to have the essential terms that are important to you. What time do you start? What time do you finish? How long are the sets and how much of break time do you have in between? And you want to have that laid out so that there's no question that you're complying with it. You know exactly what the requirements are. And it doesn't have to be complicated, although you can't get more complicated depending on the circumstance and the situation. But you want to have that as best as you can. Let's say a club owner refuses to sign a contract. Well, we live in the day and the age now of multiple forms of communication. Everybody has a cell phone. Whenever you book the gig, you can send a text, make it a nice, if you refuse, make it a friendly text just saying, I'm confirming the following. And you put the essential terms in there, send them an
Mhm.
email. Better that you have a signed contract. And then in the text or email, if you can't get a signed contract, you can put if you have any disagreement or any objection to anything in here, or if you feel I've made any errors in what I've set forth here, please, you tell me within 24 hours, 72 hours, 3 days, within 1 week, however much time would be reasonable, and we can discuss it, because that way you have everything memorialized in some way in writing. But again, and try your best to have it sent in a way that's verifiable. If you send somebody certified mail, well, they get maybe taken back. Well, why are you sending me certified mail? Don't you trust me? But emails nowadays have things or text message where it says delivered and where it says read. So you have some level of confirmation, although not as ironclad as a signed certified mail receipt or a hand delivery or something like that. But this way, you have some confirmation of what it is. Another thing that you could try to put in your contracts, if possible, depending on what a lot of it's going to go to what your bargaining power is. I mean, if you're a new artist going in and this is your first time working and it's a brand new band and nobody's familiar with it, some things may be harder to get than they otherwise would. But if you're more established, you can require a deposit. You can make a percentage. We need 50, especially if you're on a tour and you're traveling from town to town and you're not just working locally, get a deposit 50%, 25%, enough that would cover your expenses so that you're not in the hole if somebody cancels a gig and you've already bought whatever it is, whether it's plane tickets, bus tickets, train tickets, or even if it's just turned down other work that you otherwise would have been able to do that then no longer would be available to you if they cancel on you.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. You're out on tour and you have a whole bunch of gigs booked, and then somebody cancels on you, and then all of a sudden it's that night that you guess what? You don't make any money.
Right,
So yeah, so that would be great if you could get them to give you money up front.
right,
Yeah, yeah,
right.
absolutely. Uh, all right.
I mean, I'll give you an example, and I think you were there. I know our friend, one of our friends was there. There used to be a place here called the Flag Post. I don't know if you remember the Flag Post down on
I
Route One.
certainly do. Yeah, I
And
remember
we,
the flag post. Was that on Route One
Route One,
South?
Route One, down Route One in South Brunswick.
Yeah, yeah.
And we worked there fairly often. And one time we worked there, and I brought in a singer who's also a very good drummer. My friend Larry Jones, who we went to college with, and we opened up with Lou Rawls' song "You'll Never Find." And apparently, I guess they weren't enthused about rhythm and blues music being played. And the next thing you know, a little while later, another band came in, and we got sent home. Not because we played badly, but because of the selection of song. And at that point, we without a contract, and this is before I became a lawyer and everything, and it was a very low paying gig. I think we were getting paid like $45 a night. That was a notoriously low paying room, but you take
Uh,
it just to have some work, and or if you're trying to have a band, you're trying to work some things out in a live setting. It's got other values than what you're getting paid. And we had to go home because what were we going to do at that point? And I don't think we ever worked there again. But in that situation, if you had had a deposit, if you had a contract, you would have had some leverage legally to go in and either take, if you had to sue them, or if you had to get some recourse to get some compensation for what for what you did.
yeah. I mean, I did a gig even through an agency one time, and um, it was probably the most horrible thing that ever happened to me. We're playing, and the owner comes out, and it's a swank restaurant, and the owner comes out in this dirty white T-shirt, like he's in the back cooking or whatever. Stop! Stop! Stop
Mm,
right now! And I'm like, what? Stop! Just stop! I'm
mm,
like, okay, what's going on here? And we were covering for a band that left them high and dry. They had no entertainment. So the agent said, look, this guy's stuck for a night. Why don't you go in and play? We'll help him out. You can make a couple of bucks. So I was like, sure. So we went in there and we were like a beach bar band. And this was a swank Italian restaurant. And the guy starts yelling, we wanted Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. And we're up there, wasted away again in
yeah,
Margaritaville.
yeah,
So, yeah, so we got sent home, but yeah, we never got any money from that.
right.
I was so embarrassed. I didn't know what to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's stories about that. Somebody who went into the Brown Derby in Brooklyn, and they had band had some black and some white people, and I guess they didn't appreciate that, and they turned off the electricity on the bandstand. And different things happen. I was able to collect for my client on that one, but different things happen that are out of your control. And I think there was a singer named Gilbert O'Sullivan from back in the day, and he had a song, I think an album called "I'm a Writer, Not a Fighter." So we don't go into these places to have fights, but you just you want to protect yourself so that if that happens, you can gracefully uh, make your exit, but you still have recourse to come back later on to get what you're entitled to.
Yeah, and a club, when a club owner stiffs you, it's just like you have to make the decision, do I go after him and fight him and never ever play this place ever again? Or, because a lot of times, sometimes it's a place that you could work at maybe 10 or 12
Hmm.
times a year. And a lot of times you just say, well, oh, well, he had a bad night, and, just chalk it up to that. You can work with your favorite clubs, but, if people are just being out and out, um, spiteful. You bring a lot of people and places jammed, and at the end of the night they try to give you half the pay. Then
Hmm.
that might make you mad enough.
Right. I mean, and sometimes, excuse me, if you do things in a way, well, first you're going to realize if they're doing it to you, they're not just doing it to you; they're doing it to somebody else, more likely than not. And sometimes, if that's never happened to them, or they do it and nobody does anything about it, they feel they can just continue to do it.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that's definitely what happens. And musicians are pushovers. A lot of us, we're always just like, oh yeah, well, okay, and
mhm.
it'll be better next time, or whatever. But
Right.
well,
Well,
yeah, when you make an agreement, you should stick to the agreement.
right.
That's
Right. Yeah. I mean, the days of handshake agreements, unless it's somebody who you're very close to and have absolute trust in, and even then, I wouldn't suggest it. You have it in writing,
yeah,
one
like
form or another.
Stone Cold Steve Austin, DTA. Don't trust anyone.
Yeah, well, whatever. Yeah, yeah. Now there you have somebody who probably can intimidate somebody, as an example, and then maybe they
Yeah.
don't want to mess with somebody who they may physically be afraid of, and he has the intimidation factor before them. So they have a certain level of different type of respect for somebody in those shoes. But at the same time, you don't want to. You don't want to create a situation where somebody can turn it around and make it sound like you're difficult, because then they won't want to hire you no matter how good you are.
Right.
But if you can show and you make an example of somebody, um, perhaps you had to go through that. It may have been some level of expense for you, but you're not only helping yourself, you're helping anyone else that goes in there after that. And you're
That's
actually,
true.
in many ways, you may be creating a better place to work. And uh,
Yeah,
that's yeah.
musicians are generally afraid to do that, and that's why musicians always have to keep reinventing themselves, because it's like sometimes I feel like it's like whack-a-mole. You know what I mean? Your head comes up and you're like, yeah, I'm doing good. Bang, bang,
Mhm.
bang. Musician down, down, down.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
all
well,
right,
I
so
can give you
let's say,
a great example. I'm sorry to interrupt you, John, but I can give you a great example of that, which we've spoken about a little bit before in general terms. I have somebody, actually a good friend of mine, and still a good friend of mine, who worked with somebody very, very famous, and in very well known clubs in places around the world. Somebody who, if I mentioned the name, which I won't, you would recognize if almost immediately. And this very well known person who's been around for 50, 60 years at least went on a tour, and my client, he had music, and he worked on Broadway. He had full time plus work. He taught at several universities. He had a lot of students. He had if you wanted to, 7 nights a week, working shows, sometimes two shows a day. So his income was established here. and the well-known person wanted him to go on the road with them to Asia, to Detroit, and to I think Japan, China, and Detroit. And he said, "Look, I would do it, but this is how much I would make here in the states. So if I'm going to go with you, I've got to get at least that, because not only am I losing the money if I don't work here, I have to let my students down, and then I have to make up to them what they lost, because it's college, the courses and things." So they came to the agreement that he would pay that. They went on the road. At the end of the tour, he handed them a check for less than half of that money. Now, historically, over the course of time, people said, they felt like, wow, I'm lucky just to be working with this person. They did nothing. I guess it was the camel that broke the straw back. He came to me, and I also knew this well-known person, and we had a good, friendly relationship. Never played with him or anything, but I knew him because I'd seen him play in various places and spoken to him, and he actually introduced me to this friend, and I made a choice, that I thought it was enough to do the right thing. I represented my friend. We ended up getting 2,000 more than he was promised to be paid, but we made the point to this person that you can't do that to anybody. And as far as we understand, we haven't heard complaints that he's done the same thing since then, but we did hear complaints about that beforehand. So what you've done is you've let somebody know that you can't do this, because sooner or later somebody's going to stand up. And famous people, and even a lot of musicians, and a lot of people who are very good at what they do, develop egos. People who are well known develop egos, and being taken to court, for example, or being shown that you were wrong in a situation like that, does have an effect in many cases, and more often than not. So getting back to the point, if everybody just lets the club owners get over on you, then they're just going to keep doing it. So at some point, you want to set yourself up with the tools, getting back to where we started with contracts and things, so that you have something to enforce, and you have clear, unambiguous terms. That's why I said it can be simple, the essential terms of what you would put in what the agreement is, and you have something to enforce if you had to go and make if you had to sue them, if you had to go in with a mediation or arbitration, whatever the case is, you have the evidence and the proof to substantiate the claims you're making, and then you're in a good position to go in and either avoid it happening in the first place, or get your remedies in the event that it does happen.
Yeah, that's good advice. That's for sure.
Hmm.
And what about like record contracts? How did I mean? I never had a record contract. I've always been a side man
Hmm.
and things like that. Um, do you have any insight that you could share about that? I mean, because I know so many artists have gotten the short end of the stick a
Hmm.
lot of times, and a lot of times musicians just jump at the chance to do something and they wind up basically hurting themselves.
You're absolutely right, and it's not just the sidemen or people you've never heard of, unless you're in the business itself, who get the short end of the stick a lot. A lot of very well-known people have gotten that as well. And I mean, Motown Records, Atlantic Records is famous for some things like that. But you're looking at a circumstance where if you're going to have a record contract, you want to have it in writing. You want to have all your essential terms in there, and you want your essential terms, and you also want to be mindful of having what your legal rights are addressed in there. And you can say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, if you're recording your music, or if you're recording your own versions with unique expression in there, I'm going to talk about expression if we have time in a second. If you have your own versions and your own parodies, let's say, of other people's music, and you're recording that, you want to protect the rights that you have, and you've got copyright. So let's talk about copyright. Copyright, you have, think of it like a bundle of sticks. It's not just one right. You have several different rights. You have the phonographic rights. You have, the different rights in there that you can parse out. and you can separate them in certain circumstances as far as allowing somebody else to use it or in the contract itself. And you want to make sure that you can maintain as much of those rights as possible. You know, if you have something that you feel is commercial, is potentially hit record or hit, we use the record, we're dating ourselves when we use that word, right? But hit quality stuff from a commercial perspective, you want to make sure you protect it because that's something that's going to continue to sell. You know, I mean, we still listen to music from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and old music uh, is not necessarily outdated. Some old music is just as modern and contemporary as some of the new stuff we hear today, and even if it's not, people listen to stuff from all different eras. So those rights in that copyright and the values of them, which is what you're really protecting, they continue. And you want to maintain as many of those as possible. An example is that I can think of right now, this piano player that I did a recording with once did the keyboard, which was the main part and really the composition part of a song called "Shake You Down" by an artist called Jeffrey Abbott, I think his name was. It went on to be a #1 record. He got paid $500 for his work. Now, if he had had a contract and had that all spelled out, he would have gotten, well, let's just say a lot more than $500, and he'd still be getting paid today, because somewhere, somehow, that song's still generating revenues at some point, just like in most commercial music. So there's very important that you do that. You want to be mindful of your rights and how they're addressed. A lot of times the company that's doing the recording is going to want to have your rights and the copyrights of the music transferred to them. And how much of that you're going to be able to avoid and still get that contract is going to likely depend on your bargaining power. But and it's also going to depend on probably the quality and maybe fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the commercial viability of that content, meaning if you're looking at it from dollars and cents, right? So in that particular case, you want to make sure that you are protecting your rights in, because your rights in that copyright are what are going to translate into your values going down the road, and some other things too. I mean, you've got royalties and things like that that all sort of coexist in this big bubble with copyrights and everything else, and you want to make sure that as much of that as possible is maintained. And of course, you also have to keep the understanding that the record company's not signing you on so only you can make money. Your record doesn't exist unless that record company exists at that point in that particular circumstance, unless you begin your own label, which you can do as well nowadays with all the equipment that's available out there.
Right.
You can
Yeah.
go in your basement.
Nowadays, that's everybody's doing it because there's all of the labels per se labels.
Hmm.
What, I don't even know how many there are. I mean, what Sony. That's all I can think of.
Columbia, which is
But
connected to Sony, but and they're all.
but
I mean, there's tons of labels that are small labels out there
right,
that
right.
do things you could sign with.
That's true.
But
Yes.
here's what I think, and it's an observation from my part that we can sit and we can realize here is that with the equipment that's available these days, even your cell phone, in many cases, if you can do a lot of things now without this big expensive studio equipment and the big studio rental, equipment that is not as anywhere near as expensive and is much more accessible as far as being able to get it and own it for individual musicians than before. So if you can, have your skill in using that equipment to at least get yourself started there, you're going to save, and now your bargaining power is going to start to flow a little bit more towards you because you can have a product that's much closer to a final product
Oh yeah.
than in the past, where you'd have to go into the recording studio and basically start from the beginning. And a lot of times, depending on what it is, if it's more electronic stuff and things like that, a lot of that stuff you may not even need that much and accept the final mix or some mix that's going to get it sounding to the level that you would need it to sound in order to get it, you know,
Yeah, the
something that's going to
mastering
release on a record.
process.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So it all depends. So the more you can do to get your, and we're going to call it a product because we're talking about money and commercial viability and things like that, if that's how you're looking at it, the more you can get it closer to that final product, the more bargaining leverage you may have. What the record companies, depending on who they are going to have that you may not have is the resources to do the marketing to get that out. So then you want to look at, maybe if you're talking about a record company, well, the old cliche: are you going to be a big fish in a small pond? Are you going to be a small fish in a big pond? And that could also have something to do with what label you choose, and and how the music is going to get out there. So there's a lot of things that you have to look at. But if you get a record contract, um, you may be a rocket scientist outside of being a musician. I've used rocket scientist or a brain surgeon because that's the cliches and the analogies we use, right? Take that contract to somebody, a professional, who can read it, even if you don't agree with what they say in the end, who can give you a different perspective on it, and may have some other way to look at it that you may not have thought of, or something they can point out to you, perhaps from a legal perspective. We all have experiences in what we do. We don't have experiences in what we don't do. But there are people who do what we don't do who have experience in that and can better advise you on certain things. It may be things about how the different record companies are going to react to this, how maybe you may negotiate a better deal, or even what you really need to look out for, because sometimes something that sounds really, really great in the end isn't. And you want to make sure that you have all those things covered. So you may want, and there to have a contract reviewed is not going to be that expensive. If anybody's charging you thousands of dollars just to review a simple contract, go somewhere else. $500, $1,000 to review a contract, and maybe do a little bit of revisions in it for you. It's not a tremendous amount for what you're getting into. You're not getting into that record contract not to make money. You're getting into that agreement to make something out of it as a business decision. So you want to make sure that everything is in order for yourself, and you're not going to have any surprises, because you don't want surprises when it comes to that, because sometimes, very rarely, surprises are good. Much more often, surprises are bad.
That's for sure.
Mhm,
That's for sure. Well, that's a lot of great advice, John.
mhm,
It was a pleasure having you on the show, and
mhm.
we'll make some great music together sometime soon. I
Okay.
hope. I
Yes,
hope
yes.
we'll get that. We'll uh, we'll get the food going and the beer flowing, and make some music. Not that I
Absolutely.
drink beer, but the food is always nice.
Yeah,
John,
there you go.
put
We
out a
all we all have to eat
spread.
sometime, right?
Yeah, you always put out a great spread.
Yeah. If I may, can I just put my contact information out here, just in
Oh
case anybody has
yes,
any questions?
absolutely, absolutely. Oh, and if you're getting value out of this video, don't forget, hit the like and subscribe. And we're going to tell you where you can get in touch with Mr. Allen.
Right. And if enough people like it and subscribe, maybe we'll do a video, or we'll add one or two instruments, and you and I will do a little playing for him. How about that?
Oh yeah, yes. I got one more shot to get, and then I'll be inoculated, and then I'll be a little more attent to roll around.
Okay. All right. Well, everybody read up on the shots before you get them. There's a lot of information out there that's raising concerns. But in any event, you can reach me. It's Law Offices of John Charles Allen in New Brunswick, New Jersey, 292 Livingston Avenue, New Brunswick, New Jersey. 292 Livingston Avenue, New Brunswick, New Jersey. It's on the corner of Ward Street and Livingston Avenue. And my phone number is 732-828-9200. And
Yep,
thank you for
and I'll
listening.
put all that information in the comments in the video, and if you have a specific email that you want me to put in there, I could put some links in. But I'll have some links and ways that you can get in touch with John. And as always, it's always a pleasure hanging out with you. We go back years and years and years. I don't even want to say how many years. And it's always been a pleasure to work with you as a leader and play different gigs and hopefully more and more in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're at the age now, John, where we start counting backwards. But the same here. Right.
Yep, yep. All right, peace, my friend. Thank you
All
so
right.
much. I really
All right.
appreciate you being on.
Okay. Anytime. Anytime. You know where to find me.